The Roderick Ireland Courthouse's air, water, and other workplace environmental factors are not making employees who work there sick. That was the conclusion of a draft report issued in January. Still, after 2 employees died of Lou Gehrig's disease, some employees remain unconvinced. Springfield District Court First Justice John Payne is leading a 22-member Environmental Advisory Committee, which is calling for additional answers from the Environmental Health and Engineering, Inc., which issued the report. We spoke in the studio.
The committee was set up about a year and a half ago, and it was set up by the administrative leaders in Boston of the trial court. And they asked a number of us who work in the court complex at the Hall of Justice to serve on this committee to do some review and examination and make some determinations as to what the environmental quality is of the courthouse. And they've given us a lot of autonomy, and we've been doing this for the last year and a half. With their assistance, we were able to get an environmental company to come in and do a full study. Their report was released several weeks ago, and now we're in the process of reviewing that. And we'll be meeting with those folks again in the next week or so to ask them a number of questions and raise some of the concerns that the members of the committee have even after this report has been submitted.
Yeah, some of the concerns that people had leading up to this report, and one of the driving factors for it, were the overall health issues within the building. And this report came out and said that they're not making a correlation between some of the environmental factors, dust, dirt, excessive mold, which was found in the building, but they're not linking that to health problems in the building. What was your reaction when you saw that in the report?
Well, they took a survey of the employees before they began their test, and I think what they have found is that some of the issues that are in the building are consistent with a number of the complaints, certainly the respiratory complaints that a number of employees had raised. What they have not been able to find at this point is any correlation or causation between the building itself and some of the very severe medical issues that a number of employees have had. Does that mean that they're not there? I don't know, but right now, given the testing that they have done, there has been no causal relationship found between the condition of the building and those illnesses.
And 2 of the very dire illnesses, 2 of the judges that you were colleagues of yours who passed away from ALS, that really raised concerns that what a coincidence that 2 men who shared the same office were killed by the same disease, and also these conditions exist within the building. So people sort of naturally started relating those 2. But some of the challenges that I think I saw that you spoke about this in the Republican is we don't know what causes ALS, really.
Well, the report deals a little bit with that. There are a number of factors that have been viewed as potentially causing ALS, but it's never been clearly defined and recognized. And there are issues that in the building that could be of concern that ALS might be an issue there. There are environmental concerns that are looked at by the people who study that particular disease. But again, there's just no causal connection that has been found to demonstrate that.
In terms of the actual conditions of the building, Don Trieger from the Republican was there last summer and took some photographs that showed some buckets catching water leaking, some areas of vents that looked to be mold surrounding entire vent areas. Even one photo that showed looked like an old gym sock sort of stuffed into molding to capture some of the water. Have any of those problems been fixed?
They are in the process of being worked upon right now. I think the report talked about the fact that the moisture that comes in the building because of the leaking through the windows, the creation of molds, has to be dealt with. And the administrative office has indicated that they are going to be taking some fairly straightforward and serious actions to eliminate those problems.
What's morale like in the building right now? I mean, I understand from Stephanie Baer's reporting in the Republican that people are still very concerned. Even though this report said no direct correlation, they're still very concerned. I'm just curious about overall morale in the building.
Well, I'm not sure I can speak to overall morale. I mean, the people who work in that building do a remarkable job every day. our district court, which is only one part of the court, is the busiest district court in the Commonwealth. And we maintain a staff that works very hard to serve the public. I think the other courts there, the probate court, the Superior Court, the Registry of Deeds, and the courts that are over in the Juvenile and Housing Court do a remarkable job in serving the citizens of the Commonwealth. But people have concerns, understandably, when they see issues that have been documented occurring, and when they have their own health issues, particularly these respiratory concerns that have been documented. I think that there is a concern. They want answers. They want to know what can be done to alleviate these matters.
What about for you specifically? You work there every day. How do you feel being in the building?
I don't have a problem with being in the building. I'm aware of the concerns. I monitor my own health and so forth, but you go in and you do your job and you try to get through the day and move on.
Yeah. What about the fact that members of the public are coming in and out of the building? Are you aware of any phone calls that people have made or concerns the public has raised about, coming to the juvenile court or coming to the court to do the business that they need to do?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, people who come into the court usually are there for a specific reason and are there for a limited period of time, and so you wouldn't expect that to be an issue. I know that the members of the bar who are sometimes in the court every day, they're a part of our committee, and they have a representative on our committee, and they're notified, and they were part of the survey that the environmental company took. So I think that those individuals who are in the court on a regular basis are much more attuned to what's going on.
I know the environmental committee also had been coming up with some additional questions that maybe they would want to forward to the consultant. Have those questions been compiled and sent yet?
They're in the process of being compiled right as we speak. I expect to have them tomorrow. The committee will meet next week to kind of refine and narrow down those questions, and we will submit them to the environmental company, and then we hope to meet with them as a committee within the next week or two, and then kind of ask them those questions and to ask them why this was done or wasn't done. Should something else be looked at? Are there other steps that an examination or a review should be undertaken in order to answer some of those concerns?
Have you or any other members of the committee said, maybe we need a second opinion about this, what the consultant found?
No, I don't think so at this point. I mean, we're comfortable with the consultant. I think everyone was very pleased when they came in. We had the ability as the committee to make the recommendation for what consultant we wanted through the bidding process, and there was a unanimous agreement that this particular company, Environmental Health and Engineering, was the company we wanted. So I think everyone's satisfied with the professional nature in which they undertook their responsibilities, but their report still leaves questions and concerns, legitimate questions and concerns for some members of the committee, and we want to address those with the company.
As these issues have become public and been talked about more frequently, there's also been discussion of whether there should be a new courthouse. Where does that idea stand?
Well, it's interesting. As we speak here today, we had a meeting yesterday with members of the legislature and some of the top administrators of the trial court, and that was one of the issues that was on the table. And, quite frankly, to be realistic on this aspect, even if they said today you're going to get a new courthouse, it would take a number of years before that could be done. But it's something that's on the, it's at least in the discussion, but there are issues certainly of capital expenditures. Where is that money going to come from? Is that money available in the capital programs that the courts have? But it's in the discussion.